Hey, yo, this Covid-19 got some of y'all shook. Maybe it's time to wake up and take a look. Yo, Corona got you scared. I hear you, man, whatever. I know you, bro. You've been scared forever. Everyone been telling you what to think. Your brain is the drain and you like to sink. I'm a fountain spreading unique thoughts like water. Get it to yourself. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Whistling in the Dark podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Bradley, down in Atlanta, Georgia. Today is Sunday, May 4th, 2020, and this is episode 44. And this episode is dedicated to my brother, Tom Bradley. I have, back by popular demand, is Dr. Adam Steele.
Hello.
Hey, welcome back. And
Thank you.
I think we really blew the doors off this coronavirus thing last episode, and we're here to just like fucking kick in your doors once again, come into your living room and talk about where we've been since April 26th. Right. Wow, it's a month. And
a lot's happened.
Yeah. Time is basically meaningless in this quarantine pandemic. I can't believe it's a month. But here we are. So a couple things. Something that just happened today, and I believe maybe you actually have the link. I don't have it pulled up. The Libertarian Party candidate for president has been nominated, and it is not Jacob Hornberger. So the Mises Caucus failed. All that shit. Dave Smith made it, I have so many more followers in the whole Libertarian Party, and seems like nobody came out or whatever. But I think this Joe Jorgensen person is not awful. I think she's an improvement from what I understand over Gary Johnson. But, I think maybe in a follow-up, we can talk more about her if anybody cares. But I don't know if you have anything to say about this lady.
I mean, to me, she looks like pretty standard Libertarian Party fare, although I didn't really have a problem with Gary either. I thought he was good. I think the most important thing is someone who's going to put a good face forward for us and continue to raise the profile of the party. To me, that is important, rather than someone who's going to voice like the most extreme version of libertarianism. So, yeah,
it's interesting. I'm not, this. I just wanted to at least touch on it since it happened, I think today, possibly last evening or something, but
it was 2 nights ago, I think, or something close to that. Yeah.
Something like that. Well, I saw it on Facebook today. I actually stopped following the Mises Caucus on Facebook as much as I am 100% aligned, literally 100% aligned with them. Their Facebook page is just insufferable. I can't it's so awful and just ridiculous. So I don't know. I think it kind of shows no matter how great of a philosophy, you're still going to have average humans.
Yes.
It's pretty brutal.
Anybody can be annoying, even if they're right.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you want to sort of steer the direction or where we start with kind of talking about the last month or where we're at today.
Yeah. There's so much to talk about. I mean, as of a month ago, there was sort of solid ground for the lockdown skeptical position, and that things were, getting better, and that the worst was probably not going to come to pass. There's even more reason to be optimistic today. I mean, it looks as of right now that what happened in sort of the New York area and adjacent is not happening anywhere else. I mean, they had a very, very severe outbreak and a lot of deaths in that small area. But you might have reasonably expected that same pattern to replicate in Chicago, in Los Angeles, and other places. And it just hasn't happened. I'll be honest, it's not totally clear to me the reasons for that, but it isn't happening. And what's also becoming more and more clear is that this isn't while the particular policy prescriptions like locking down, closing all businesses have not been shown to be effective, it is the case that like we're getting a clearer picture of where the deaths are occurring. And that's among the aged and frail. I mean, we mentioned nursing homes last time, but it's become even more clear that this is where a lot of the deaths are occurring. And there's going to be a pretty big scandal when I think all is said and done, finding out. I mean, in Pennsylvania, you had a week where 90% of the deaths, 90% in a week of all the COVID deaths were
Jesus.
in these elder care facilities. And so, at that point, it becomes even more infeasible, or it becomes harder and harder to defend keeping everyone at home when it's clear that there are specific vulnerable populations that can be taken care of.
Yeah, I've just been wondering about, like New York. People say, oh, it started earlier. That was something you heard a lot. It started earlier. So, just wait, it's coming. But it wasn't ground zero, right? I mean, that was like Washington and wasn't the Bay Area? Yeah.
There was cases there earlier in other places too, up in the Pacific Northwest too. They had their outdoor
Washington State.
Yeah, Washington State. Yeah, they had their outdoor facilities. And that's another thing we can mention is that all of these so the main logic behind Flatten the Curve originally was what we need to do is spread out the infections over a long period, because what will happen is the deaths will really go up if we exceed the capacity of our hospitals. That never happened anywhere, even in these really severe areas around New York. I had there's like a dashboard webpage for the hospitals in New Jersey where I still have a lot of family. And I was looking at those, and you could see as the pandemic was progressing that no more than a few of them any time were ever on what's called diversion. Diversion is if a hospital is saying, if you have an ambulance and you have a patient, we're full up here. And there's different levels of diversion. But it's totally common, especially during the normal flu season, for a few hospitals to be on diversion for some amount of time. And the number went up a little bit, but I mean, I think there's something like 59, something like that, hospitals in New Jersey, and no more than like 5, 6, or 7 of them were ever on diversion at any time when I saw the dashboard. Wow. So there was never the case. And of course, you can't run the counterfactual. Naturally, the people who are in favor of the lockdown say, oh, if only we hadn't done that, we would see this. But I don't really buy that, because as it was back then, they said only with these really extreme measures, we will still like come really close to seeing this kind of overflow. And it just never happened. Yeah. It's totally consistent too with like the failure of the models to predict, in particular, the number of hospitalizations, which they way overestimated. Yeah.
It's interesting to see people really hunkering down in the opinion of, I was talking to my mom earlier today about, just catching up. But we happened to mention this, and she was saying like, nobody wants to be like locked down or whatever. And I said, obviously, logically, that makes sense. But that's not how apparently the human psyche works. Once you get dug into a position, and this position is that, we absolutely have to lock down. Now it's like somehow saving face is actually more important than just having a more fun life and a better economic, and they, I was thinking that, specifically around the opening up, like you said, the counterfactual. Well, now, the only thing that you hear now is, Georgia has been open for a few weeks or 4 weeks. And I heard a number, 34% drop in like hospitalizations over that time. And now you're presented with, well, it's, but it's probably because, it's getting warmer. And so it's naturally going away. Whereas before they would actually, that same crew, the panic crew that just wants, for some reason, the country to stay locked down for a year or 18 months. I mean, isn't that what, Bill Gates is saying, until we find a vaccine or whatever. So they kind of already were saying that, well, that's not possible. But now when it becomes, convenient to try, but, it's not, there's no real basis for that. I mean, you know, if you want, sure, you can try and make the argument, but, you know, try to make the argument, at least try to present some, you know, basis for that. Like why all of a sudden, you know, the moment Georgia opened it, you know, the governor just happened to time it perfectly with the temperature increase. And it hasn't actually been that warm up until this week in Georgia. Like it's actually been
not here chilly. Either in Maryland. No.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just an insane.
I mean, the basic exercise is a pretty simple one. If you want to be intellectually honest, you say, if the reverse had happened, would I have made me more confident in my conclusion? So people are saying, well, if it had opened up and there had been a lot of deaths, they probably would have said, see, this is evidence for what I was saying before. So that you have to take seriously the idea that if it opens up and that doesn't happen, then maybe you were wrong. Right. You know, and this, you have to do that.
Yeah. Right. It's like, so no matter what. And
it isn't even like there was like a tempered view there. I mean, what was the headline in the Atlantic? Georgia was going to be an experiment in human sacrifice. Like they were the ancient Aztecs or something like that.
Oh, man. But little do they know that actually sacrificing to the gods works. And they maybe, you know,
that was it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank God that they were willing to take that risk and sacrifice a few lives then for the many, and that the gods have now smiled on us and they're pulling back the plague of 2020.
That's right. No, I've heard people crediting the Pope with the reduction too. So, you know, it's anything that people want to grasp onto.
That's probably true. He
is quite powerful.
Probably mainly due to the Pope. So, thank goodness.
So anyway, the point is that there have been several states that have been open for a month. Now, I would definitely not declare victory by any stretch at this point, because my point originally was that people's habits change slowly, and it wasn't as if you open Georgia and boom, people are out right away, heading to the stores in the same numbers that they were before. It's going to be kind of slow rise back into normal behavior.
By the way, I'm declaring victory today.
Okay. Pat has declared
Sunday,
victory.
May 24th, 2020. I declare Georgia's victory over COVID-19. Okay.
Mission accomplished. The big banner behind you, Pat.
Yeah, I'm gonna come flying in. I'm doing an aircraft carrier outside of whatever naval base if we have one in Georgia.
Right. But the point is that you could see some small resurgence, but it's another failure of the people who are warning to predict what would occur. I mean, it's totally possible you see another hump, but it's not arguable that it has been better than those people said beforehand. So they should take that seriously and say, well, maybe it's not quite as bad as I was predicting. Maybe more people were exposed beforehand. Maybe the kind of voluntary measures where people washing their hands more, using masks is going to continue a bit into the future. And this is enough to keep us out of another pandemic, right? Because every one of these little things can help. It's really not clear which of them is the most important, but if we do all these small things, then maybe we can still let people go to work and earn a living.
Yeah. And to me, like the most egregious part of this is continuing to not separate what, the message to high risk people, whether you're old or, you have a pre-existing condition, and then non-high risk people. The fact that it's either just we're all open or we're all closed. Like we all go back to work. We all, that's to me like not, that was the mistake, right? Like, I mean, how many people in New York, like what was that in the nursing home? I mean, you said, I don't remember the exact numbers, but the amount of deaths that happened in New York, and then the amount of deaths there in these nursing homes and stuff, if they just in that one small part of the country protected the nursing homes, you would probably see a factor of 2 drop in deaths or more. I mean,
it could be something like that. Yeah. And there was a lack of, basically there was some mixed incentives. Like you wanted people to take it seriously. And so they didn't want to emphasize that there was a smaller number of people at a very high level of risk. And so they didn't do that. Whereas, there are solutions here. I mean, you read about early on for the personal protective equipment, the mask. I mean, there was a factory in Pennsylvania where the guys who work in that factory checked in and they worked in the factory and didn't leave for 2 weeks, right? in order that they could do their work and make sure no one was sick there, and they could get the personal protective equipment out so the hospitals will have it. You could imagine similar programs like that for nursing or elder care facilities, where the people stay in the facility for extended periods of time to make sure no virus gets in. No one has done that anywhere, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And so it's just, there's a lack of imagination, and it's government focusing on what it can do most easily, which is order people around and not so much find solutions to problems.
Yeah. We always, libertarians, we just always find ourselves on this side of the debate where it's just like, it feels so sensible what we're saying and so obvious, but yet we're in like the minority of the minority.
Yes.
Like nobody's saying this, it's either that the whole thing is a hoax, or it really is like the next plague, and we're gonna have to lock down, and Krugman recently talking about how great like the just giving out money is working, and why people why do you even have to go back to work? Like production doesn't matter, but somehow we're crazy for thinking that, hey, like people actually need to like produce wealth, like it doesn't just magically come to us from the gods by our sacrifices.
Right. I mean, a simple way to say it, Elon Musk was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he just said it in like the most dumb but simple way fashion. He said, if people don't make stuff, then there won't be any stuff.
Right. Yeah, but that apparently is edgy. That is I mean, really, like he is making headlines for that,
Yes.
It's just like, it's very, 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 very interesting. Another place that I was hearing a bit about, like opening up, and then it was Texas, and there's a lot of talk about right. So what's the one place that CNN or whatever focuses on? It's Texas, and they say, oh well, look, the number of cases has been climbing, since they've opened up. But then lo and behold, the number of tests have been increasing, and it's like, just look at like we talked about this the last episode about the number of positive cases is just not a dependable number. I mean, it's just all over the map, and it's depends so heavily on not just how many tests you're doing, but also like what type of, are you randomly testing, you're testing people with symptoms or whatever. But if you kind of look at hospitalizations and deaths, that's a bit more dependable. Now, I may be a little skeptical even of the death number, but whatever. And even if that's
been new in the last month too. But I mean, it basically what Pat is referring to is the fact that if you have someone who comes to the hospital who is positive for COVID, but have a lot of other underlying conditions, and they pass away, what is the correct way to record that? Consistency is very important, but we're also interested in knowing how deadly is COVID, right? So if they have a lot of conditions, to what extent should we attribute that death to COVID? There isn't any single good answer to that. And unfortunately, there's a financial incentive for a lot of hospitals that are having a very difficult time right now to code it as COVID. And this is not conspiracy theory stuff. I mean, that's the way the government is giving out money for these cases. So. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is absolute financial incentive to mark a death as being from COVID-19, and if you do that, I mean, it's a lot to me. That's as dependable as like gravity, right? I mean, you put a financial incentive, it's going to increase. I thought. And
normally, I would say like we should discount that heavily and say like this isn't influencing the number of deaths all that much, but it's precisely because the average age of the COVID death is so high, like roughly 77. And these folks are coming out of these nursing homes, that it will be ambiguous in a lot of the cases whether or not that was the true cause of death.
Yeah. And I think you had a rough estimate that 2/3 of the people that died of COVID-19 would die before the end of the year.
What's funny about that isn't my estimate. So the gentleman who did the modeling that supported the lockdown in the United Kingdom was one of the biggest doomsayers. He was asked in an interview what his estimate was, and that was his estimate.
Oh, wow. Oh, and this is to the nursing home one, where I don't know where this came from, but this was because I had asked this question, or I sort of jokingly said when you last time something about half the deaths have been in nursing homes, and I jokingly said, well, I'm pretty sure that half our population doesn't live in nursing homes, so it's probably dead. But you have a stat here that it's actually 0.6% of our population is nursing homes, but 50%
in New Jersey, that's the number.
Yeah, 50% of the deaths. So that's, it's outrageous. And it's pretty interesting. But, okay. So in Texas, they're harping on this as an example to say, or as evidence that opening up was the wrong move. But hospitalizations and deaths, I think, have been on the decline as usual, is most, I don't know. I mean, is there any place? I think possibly California or LA has seen an increase in deaths, or
I haven't seen anywhere where there was an increase after they opened anything. In fact, in Denmark, they locked down quite strong, and they started to reopen. There was a very interesting article where they said, they did expect, particularly because they did such a good job. So if you do an extremely good job and you think your lockdowns work, that means you're saying, well, we think not many people were exposed to it early on. So you would naturally expect when we open up, you would see some resurgence. So they opened up pretty conservatively a little bit, and they don't see any resurgence. So they said, okay, well, we're just going to keep, the officials there at least have the humility to say, we don't understand why we're not seeing a resurgence, but we're happy about it, and we're just going to keep opening things up until we do.
Yeah. And it's kind of, I mean, I think it's going to be one of these things that in a month or two or whatever, it's literally going to be off the table as a discussion. Like whenever it ends, it's going to end completely. And it's going to be replaced by some new insane panic. And I'm almost certain the insane panic is going to be directed around Donald Trump. Even though all of the news that's coming out is all the Obamagate, some good marketing there by Trump. But, all this stuff coming out about how, the Obama administration was like spying on Trump, like during the election, or possibly at least after it, before he was in office, and, hiding that fact. And they knew the Steele dossier was like a complete farce, but they still like went with it anyway. But I don't think any of that will pick up steam because, outside of Fox News, all the major media is just like literally propaganda for the Democratic Party at this point. Like, and I guess Fox News is like the Republican propaganda, but it just seems pretty weak. We got to depend on, well, not that we're Republicans, but to get anything but like the Democrat propaganda, it's like you got like Alex Jones and Fox News. Pick your poison there, buddy.
Yeah. Great news sources. I mean, the response has not been, which is interesting. The response was not super partisan to COVID. I mean, there was an attempt, of course, to say that the federal government mishandled it. And to some extent, I'm sympathetic to that view. But it wasn't like you had Republicans on one side saying we should definitely stay open and Democrats on the other saying we should definitely close. It wasn't like that. I mean, even the reopenings, we've talked about Georgia and Florida and Texas, but Colorado opened up to a large extent too. And it just doesn't get talked about as much, because there you have, I believe, a Democratic governor probably. So there's not as much of a partisan, bone to pick there. And I think that's poisoning the debate as well. I mean, in the best of times, it's hard to get people to focus on the data. But if there's any partisan advantage to be had by misinterpreting it, you can expect that to happen as well.
Yeah. And that's actually kind of interesting, because what I was thinking is, are you talking about the Republican Party officials or like voters and Democrat? Are you talking about like a partisanship? Because I believe in the voting base, or at least the social media, bases. I feel like there has become, a pretty big partisanship or partisan divide around.
There is there, absolutely. Yes.
Which is, honestly, I hadn't really considered how interesting that is, that, it's like, hey, man, I mean, say what you want, but at the end of the day, the man at the top of like the nationwide quarantine. Now, you could say that he actually did leave it to the states. And so, and I guess like it's interesting that just very often I feel like the Trump's words and actions are like very disconnected. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could talk about, you could look at some of his comments as being, pretty like anti-war, but I mean, is he really, but his actions are, horrific. I mean, go ask anybody, any citizen of Yemen, for example.
Yes.
And, he's a bit of a mixed bag, it's certainly better than, we've seen in a while. He hasn't started any new fronts, I guess. So that's great. And I guess Syria is sort of we've kind of left there, I guess. But, I don't know. It's really hard. And I get it's probably a fool's errand to even try to make sense out of his discourse.
It is, but if there was one time where his recklessness and his willingness to like disregard all conventional wisdom would have actually paid dividends, it would have been in COVID. Yeah. And he didn't come through there. I had conversations with really democratic liberal people who nevertheless were saying that the lockdown and the response to COVID was overdone. And they were happy in the beginning to hear that Trump might be like not as far in that direction. But since then, he has been for all the lockdowns. He was bad mouthing Sweden's policies and their strategy. So, it's a fool's errand to try to make anything sensible out of what he says. That's why I just try not to talk about it too much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And you could say that. Maybe that's like CNN is just, I guess it's sort of just an absolute gift to them that never stops giving, just like they don't really need to make a really cogent argument anyway. Like everybody that's going there is already, very entrenched in their positions, and they just continue to get them just torqued up over and over and over this stuff. So,
yeah.
But anyway,
but back to COVID.
Yeah. So the Texas and Colorado. I don't know what so I was out. I've actually been going out a good bit more recently. Just one day, I actually ate at a restaurant. So I felt like a real freedom fighter that day. I went and I got a chicken salad with grilled chicken, because I'd been eating such trash at my house. It really devolved.
Yes.
So that was nice. We ordered, it was basically like you're just getting takeout and then you go sit down. You could stay in the restaurant, but we sat outside. It was a pretty nice day. And today we did the same thing. It was like a real outdoor kind of restaurant anyway. Had some breakfast tacos and went to a coffee shop and then sat out there with a buddy of mine for an hour or so. But the whole time, probably saw 4 people go in. So it's interesting. This place would be bumping. This is in Atlanta, a very like hip neighborhood. Coffee shops are, a main hub of a lot of stuff there. And barely anybody going in. It's amazing that I feel like the margins on a coffee shop got to be tough to begin with.
Yes.
Not having, basically any income for months. Maybe they had some cash reserves or something.
Well, this is one of my main concerns with the lockdown is that I saw a graph of the number of weeks that businesses had on hand, and it sort of had a lump and with a sort of a longer tail to the positive side, but the average was only like 3 weeks of cash to pay expenses. Now, if you fire everyone, maybe you can make that out longer. But the reality is, if this goes on much longer, there aren't going to be the businesses to hire people back. Yeah. When the government is going to say, oh, okay, it's safe to go back to work, and the businesses to rehire folks aren't going to be around anymore.
Yeah. It's going to be a great buying opportunity for any of us that have been able to make it through with some with some money to burn at the end of this thing, well, we can, yeah.
I suppose so.
We can pick through the bones.
But yeah, you could see a real further collapse of small businesses and more market share going to the larger entities, the Walmarts, the Amazons, and them. And I don't have anything against those companies. I think they do a great job. But the reality is that those businesses have access to capital and loans that can see them through the rough times much more easily than the small businesses.
Yeah.
One of the things that made no sense about these PPP loans that the government was handing out basically, free to small businesses to make their payroll was that to get the loan turned into a grant and be forgiven, you had to keep everybody on the payroll. Well, if you give a company a grant and force them to keep everybody on the payroll when you don't have the work for them, you're not increasing their runway, which really should be the goal of this thing.
Right.
So it's not very well thought out.
Surprisingly.
Yeah, I know.
I expected them to knock this one out of the park, but
yeah, I mean, these few hundred page bill dumped, a few hours before it was expected to be passed. Oh, very little time to review it, and then after the fact, they're responding to people being upset that the large restaurants that they explicitly wrote in that they had access to were actually taking advantage of it. Big surprise. It's free money up for grabs. They're going to grab at it. Yeah. And so then they it's so often the case these days that Congress passes an extremely vague bill. They leave it to the executive branch agencies to sort out the details. Mm-hmm. And then everybody is upset at whatever gets decided. But it's just an example of the legislature not doing its job. I mean, somebody has to work out the details. So,
yeah. I mean, they're so far from being able to do it. In a non-pandemic, it's a nightmare. So this is, this is I feel like this is the time that all the awful stuff comes through that much easier.
Yes, exactly.
So I just wanted to put a little pin in something you said for maybe another follow-up episode.
Sure.
We'll let the people decide. But so, and it kind of, this was something I was thinking about because between you and I don't COVID-19 isn't really the obvious topic that we would be coming together on. But it is. It just happened that had been doing so much, sort of research into it or whatever, staying up on the research, at least we'd say that it was a nice place to come together. But talking about so I think that this is a place that I tend to diverge, and I don't think it's in a fundamental way, but from the sort of, I don't know, the tenor of what I hear a lot of libertarian commenters, they like you said, I don't have a problem with Walmart. They do a good job, et cetera, et cetera. But, and, if I go back to your statement to me that sort of kind of turned the light switch on was the idea that, in a free market, it's not just one company just swallows another until you just have this one gigantic company that owns everything that in markets tend to be sweet spots or whatever. And then the sort of extension of that is the reason that we get these insanely huge corporations that are able to spread across, the whole world and is because of the regulations and government sort of. So I think that there is no actual disagreement. I think it's just the way we choose to talk about it. And I find it strategically, to me, I think that, and maybe I am doing my appeal. It's almost like, what audience do you want to sound more appealing to? Because I think that there's a lot of truth in Walmart and other of these large multinational corporations doing a great job. To me, I often think about Amazon because Amazon has been getting demonized lately. And it's whoa, man, they're the thing that, they're right now the glue that's holding this whole world together. It's the marketplace that we're all able to find stuff without having to if you're so scared to infect each other, and now you're going after the one. It's they demonize the company that actually had the infrastructure to allow us to continue to function. So it's hard for me to like sort of get on board with that. But, I think I kind of do this more as maybe a feeble attempt to appeal to my more left-leaning friends when I am able to sort of stay purely as like, in my free market position, but yet show that, I am not like for the, what's going on with Walmart, but it takes, you have to take a look at their relationship with government. And anyway, I really wanted to put sort of a pin in that for a future topic, because I think it's something that, to me, it was the key. Like, understanding that was the key that unlocked it. And I think that if you buy that, then all of it just sort of comes out from that point. Then, at that point, it becomes really difficult to me to argue for like government monopoly on anything. But anyway, we'll
save that. We'll save that.
Yeah. But I think it plays it's in everything, it's the testing failure, whenever. I mean, that's chalk it up once again, right? The market would have solved that, allowing people to like actually decide how to best protect themselves and all different levels of life, whether you're, 80 years old in a nursing home or I mean, if you own a nursing home, you don't want all of your patients to die. Right. Like, and then, nursing home B, they protect them and they put in all of these, things where they have, like you suggested, with people staying overnight for weeks at a time, and all of their patients survive. Who's going to do better in the future?
Right.
I mean,
knowledge. So people were looking to the federal government for guidance early on, but the knowledge of the situation on the ground was distributed. And this is what a market does. It is a mechanism by which distributed amounts of information can be used to guide decisions in an intelligent way without there being any central or single person that understands the totality of the circumstances. It's not required for good decision making. And we put all that power and faith in the CDC and the FDA, and they have just from start to finish made mistake after mistake after mistake. From getting the tests ready to approving new test mechanisms. I mean, there was a story the other week where there was an at-home COVID test that had been running for a month and a half. And the FDA found out one day that the data was being used not just to get information for the university that it was running out of, but also getting the results to patients. And they said, nope, you got to pull that off the market. They said it was more important to have their finger in all the pies so that they can be the ultimate arbiter of what counts as a good test than to give people access to testing that they wouldn't otherwise have, because it would require them to leave their house to get a prescription from their doctor or something else, depending on the state that they were in.
Yeah.
So let's see. What are some other interesting topics? I mean, we could talk about herd immunity. We could talk about lab release. We can talk about previous pandemics. What do you think? How about
COVID modeling review?
Sure.
I actually did see some of this, and as a programmer, that is what I sort of morphed into after my brief career in physics.
Right.
This was pretty good. I didn't get too detailed in it, but something about like their main model was just like one giant file.
Yeah,
it's so bad.
Yeah, I mean, for people who don't do programming, this will not be as funny, but it's like if you ran a warehouse and instead of having like shelves with everything neatly stacked around the perimeter, you put everything in a big pile in the center of the room. Yeah. That's what the single 15,000 line file. So to step back, this was the main model that came out of Imperial College in the United Kingdom that really got the government to change its mind on its strategy from a more Sweden-like one of social distancing to one that was relied heavily on locking down and keeping people in their homes, was a model that predicted many hundreds of thousands of deaths if they took to their previous strategy. And the gentleman who came up with this, unfortunately, I'm sad to say he was a former physicist. I know.
Absolutely. So I was a computational physicist, and I can assure you that, and I went through a very computational heavy undergraduate at Drexel University.
Okay.
We actually had a battery of classes that were computational physics, and we had to take, I think maybe only 1 or 2 computer science electives, but it was embedded in our curriculum, computational physics, and it was all in C. I had never been taught anything about how to actually program, though. It was just like, get this answer, get to this endpoint, right. But there's no computer science. All of that I've learned on my own over the years, like doing much more like web development and sort of stuff like that, and learning these types of principles, how to organize your code and how to architect, systems and all of this stuff. I definitely had this sort of big file mentality.
Right.
I split it up. I didn't even know.
What's the point, right? Yeah. It's as you work on larger projects or work with more than one person in particular, it becomes very important to organize these things, have good comments and documentation for all of these things. And these were all lacking. And you can see in basically the equivalent of Freedom of Information Act requests over there, collaborators trying to use this code to replicate his results and having a lot of problems. The code was sort of non-deterministic, so you could run it the same. You could run it the same thing more than once, and it would give you different results, significantly different results, like tens of % different. And their guidance to the collaborators was, well, just run it a whole bunch of times and average it all together. It's like, okay. Now, there's nothing in particular problem with this stochastic model, but the model is supposed to be deterministic, and it basically isn't because of things having to do with it running on them trying to get it to run multi-core and race conditions and all stuff that will just sound like jargon. But the point is, it was fundamentally broken code. And they handed it over to Microsoft at some point, who spent weeks revising it for them. And that is the code that we actually have access to. Very few people have access to the original code. And so the nightmare that I'm describing is the post-comb-over nightmare, if you will. Yeah.
It's pretty unbelievable that. And this does kind of touch on another topic that I think is really becoming out in my mind now with this, but also, I think with the, climate change debate, you sort of heard very sort of similar, just similar topics of, trust science, believe in science, or if you don't believe in this, you don't believe in science. And I've said a lot particularly with climate change to people, it's like, look, I'm not a climate scientist. My biggest source of skepticism is that the demons that are running this war machine are all trying to shove this down our throat too. So that makes me skeptical. But I'm not reading this research. I'm not doing these models. It's extremely complicated. But I will say that I have seen how the sausage gets made, at least in my one little corner of computational neuroscience. And it's not very beautiful. At the end of the day, I feel yes, I published peer-reviewed research, but I really don't think that the people that reviewed it, honestly, really looked at it. I don't know. I don't know how to explain it.
It doesn't surprise me at all. No.
They kind of did. And I just cited, previous people, but it starts to become this chain of well, you're citing this person that cited this person that cited, and then you come down to what's at the base of it? What's the root? A 15,000 page or line, single file of just gobbledygook with hundreds of parameters that nobody really understands.
Hey, there's a name for this that they have that I've seen in some of the other things, usually not associated with the sort of harder sciences, but it's called idea laundering. It's the idea that, you pass a concept through a trusted chain and it pops out the other side, no more validated against the real world than it went in, but it has the the attraction of having come out of a major university or a major, scientific journal.
Yeah.
And so that is cause to believe in it for a lot of people. That shouldn't be necessary.
Yeah.
All of these ideas should be kind of independently confirmable. And the big problem with this in particular and climate science is that it's very difficult. Well, in the case of climate science, it is very hard to, without waiting a long time, maybe longer than you can afford to, test the predictions of the model against reality. What's a shame here is that we didn't have to wait very long. There was a specific model. It said, if you do X, you will see Y. And then Y doesn't happen. And then people still say, well, let's look at what the model says if we open back up again. It's like, well, it was wrong the first time.
Right. Yeah.
Why should I don't need to have run the counterfactual. You told me what would happen, and it was wrong.
Yeah, it was wrong. And then when you look under the hood, it's, it's obvious that it would be wrong, that, it's like certainly like anything can be right like once. Like if you take one, might have gotten lucky at like that one, especially when it's non-deterministic. But just
that's
run it until
thing.
You get right. I guess if it's like within some boundary, then 10%.
The errors, it wasn't that small. It was very significant. It was more than 20 in many cases. So.
Yeah. So this topic is so it's such a bummer to me because I don't think the thing that I come to with it is like I just don't have a solution. Like I don't think that your average person just has the capacity to defeat like a corrupt academic community if that's the case. I mean, you're just lambs to the slaughter. I mean, like I was saying, like I don't have the ability to like do it with like the climate change, like I don't know. Whatever I read, I tend to be like, oh man, that's a pretty good point. And maybe we are all doomed. And then I read the other thing that says, oh, it's solar cycles. Like, oh yeah, probably solar cycle. You know what I mean? Like I'd have to dedicate a significant amount of my life to like get to a place. I would say that this COVID-19 has been far easier to destroy, but I also think that they're doing it on the fly, and I think it's like a much more simple, like kind of cover your ass type of situation where they've sort of stated this, and now they're just not going to come off it and wait till it just sort of falls out of
Well, there's a very perverse incentive structure that has been set up. I mean, it's extremely difficult for a politician to be handed a model like this publicly that says, if you don't do what I say, hundreds of thousands of people will die.
Right.
So you'd have to be really, really strong-willed or some kind of weird dictator to just ignore that completely. Yeah. Because, and the reality is very similar model to the Imperial College model was used in previous outbreaks for swine flu, I think for mad cow or something similar, or maybe for SARS. And it vastly overestimated the number of deaths there too. Yeah. That didn't stop it from being reused here. Yeah. Because the incentive structure these are the experts in epidemiology. Who is going to say, let's ignore them completely? Yeah. It's going to be very difficult to do. In a few places, you're going to have people who differ. And there is some professional disagreement here. And that's why you can see different strategies emerging, in different countries and different outcomes. And then you have to puzzle out whether or not the different outcomes that those countries see are from the policy or not. Yeah.
Well, one thing I can assure you is we're not going to win this argument. we're the minority of the minority of the minority, and Big Gov is going to win.
Probably.
There's too much lockstep with the big media. I mean, they have all the voices and anyway. But let's slide into something. I don't know. Pick. You got a bunch of topics. I don't know if we're going to get to all of them.
So this one's for the folks who listen that love conspiracy theories. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not this might have been released from the virology lab that was in Wuhan, China. I think the jury is really still out on that. It's not impossible. I would say there's not very strong evidence yet. Certainly the stuff that's been reported even in major newspapers, I would not take very strongly. I mean, it's like someone asserting that someone believes something and it's coming from our government, which is already, pretty antagonistic towards China. So I wouldn't take that so I'd look more towards like the actual science and looking at the genome of the viruses. And I would say it's definitely not certain yet. There's some stuff that's coming out, even in very academic circles, like real journals are looking into this question. So I think eventually we could get a sense of whether or not that's true. But there is precedent for this kind of thing. The 1977 H1N1 flu was caused by the accidental release of a 20-year-old laboratory strain. This wasn't known until substantially after the fact, but it is what happened. Basically, by looking at the genome, the scientists, many years later, was able to show that it was the same as a flu that came from some decades earlier, but it hadn't picked up enough mutations in the interim to be like a natural release in 77. It was a frozen flu and accidentally released. And that's not the only time this has happened. So, for the people who would argue that, say, this type of research is too dangerous, if it does turn out to be the case that this was released, I would say this is a point in their favor. Maybe these labs just can't implement enough protocols to keep this stuff safe.
Yeah, I mean, eventually, right, it'll get out. I mean, I guess that you would have to say, well, weighed against what? It's too dangerous, weighed against what's the...
Exactly.
What are we getting out of this? Like bioweapons? Or
no,
or
in this case, they were trying to better understand
the flu, the
parts of the genome. So basically, I think a lot of the research at these laboratories is seeing what parts of the viral genome... this was not in 77, of course, they were doing something else then, but what parts of the viral genome would be responsible for, say, how contagious a disease is. And if you could better understand that, then instead of us arguing about what the R0 is for something like the coronavirus, we could, as soon as we had isolated it in the wild, take a look at its genome, and then we say, oh, the R0 is blank. Based on that. So there's a lot of value in that. And also understanding the genome might allow for vaccines to be developed much more rapidly. So there's a lot of stuff, but I would like to see what are the outputs of that research so far versus the risks. Because it's obvious. Go ahead.
It's somewhat, along this, just on the conspiracy side, we can, let's dabble for a little bit. So something I heard very early on was people claiming that it was obvious that this was, a quote unquote man-made virus, or it had been, somehow tampered with. I haven't read much into that. I don't know if that's even a legitimate thing that is discoverable by looking at a virus to say, oh, there's no way that this sort of naturally came about, or maybe all of these are quote unquote man-made, and this is just sort of obvious already. I don't know about that.
I mean, there was a paper that came out very early on from some researchers in India suggesting that there were aspects of the coronavirus that looked like HIV, and that this was evidence that it had been engineered. But I believe that was all really soundly shot down so far. So there definitely isn't anything approaching a consensus on this, but whether or not it's that result is still up in the air. And I don't know, but I certainly haven't seen anything that convinced me. I see a lot of talk about it, but a lot of it just seems very circumstantial. Yeah.
I actually heard less talk, really. This was really early on, when I think too, because this was back when it was kind of still China mainly, and then maybe kind of coming. So there was a lot more sort of focus on China itself and how it got out. Now I think I think maybe now it's just too much. We have to just focus on us and dealing with it, and then maybe later, like you're saying. I mean, this paper was 20 years later that they finally cracked the solved the mystery or whatever. Who knows? But I guess I just wasn't sure if that's even a plausible thing. Saying that, oh, this looks like HIV or whatever. I mean, that almost is that even and not like that seems like almost like anecdotal. Like how do you really is there really like a clear marker in something like this that says like, oh, you can like see that this is like utterly like impossible, to occur naturally, or 99.99, whatever.
They have a lot of ability to look at like the lineage of viruses, and there's some very interesting papers and looking at, say, how there are different variants even of the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus already. And there's talk about the one that's mostly circulating in Europe possibly being a bit different from the one that was in China, and sort of when did various possible mutations come into effect. So there's a pretty high ability. In fact, there was a paper that just came out, which is on another topic we might want to discuss. Researchers in Israel found something in the viral genome that supported the idea that most of the spread came from a small number of people who shed a lot of virus. And this has something to do with an analysis. There have been empirical studies looking at whether or not that's the case, like just looking at how certain outbreaks started. But this is a particular view that from the genome.
The super spreaders. Those would be super spreaders.
Yes.
So exactly. If we could identify and exterminate the super spreaders, then we wouldn't even have these problems.
Exterminate the super spreaders.
Yeah. I mean, it's a small number of people.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, there's certainly not a lobby for them or anything.
Right. I don't even know if it was a joke. It was the first coronavirus case in North Korea. They just said that they shot the poor guy.
I'm sure it's not a joke.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
But the point is that, accidental releases do happen. There's still a lot of work to be done, and I don't know that it's super critical to figure that out right away. So I think the best thing to do would be to not jump on any small piece of evidence that comes out, because there are people talking a lot about this, but just to relax. And if it is true, it will come out, because that's something that's very much in the interest of every mainstream virology researcher to establish where this actually came from.
So you're saying you think it's the lineage would be the main, to sort of basically, if you could, maybe the best argument for it will be that, hey, there is no sensible lineage for this. Somebody, but it sounds like it, you're going to be sort of stuck with saying until somebody can find it. Maybe somebody later will be like, hey, we actually discovered this other strain, and now it kind of connects these dots. And
it's going to be hard to establish with certainty. I mean, it already is. I mean, there was an article and it was either Science or Nature very early on talking about they said that they really did think it came from an animal, either a pangolin or a bat, but they weren't sure. They wouldn't say for sure which one it was, because early on everyone was saying, oh, it's this wet market. It was definitely from a bat. I don't think that stuff is for sure at all. Yeah. It could be from a number of different animals, and I don't know that it's been nailed down. So you're just going to have to wait on that.
Okay. Do you want to talk about variolation?
Sure. Sure. So
can I be honest? I've never even heard that word in my entire life. Never seen it written. I've never heard it uttered.
We don't use it anymore. So back before vaccines were widely available, there was a technique called variolation. You've probably seen it. If you saw the John Adams series on HBO, you saw variolation in action.
I did not.
Okay. So the basic idea here is that the basic idea behind a vaccine is to introduce an attenuated, a weakened strain of the virus in order to sort of prime the immune system of the person receiving it. Variolation is very similar, except it's more primitive and not as safe. Basically, if you had, say, a person who had smallpox and you took a sample from one of their wounds and you'd, say, put it inside of a cut of another person or in their nasal cavity, you'd be exposing them to smallpox, of course. But the reality is that this isn't the same as being exposed to it if that person were to just, say, cough on you, or if you got it out of the environment.
Okay.
The normal, so that's variolation. It's a way of introducing a virus in a manner akin to vaccine, but not nearly as safe. So smallpox, about 30% of the people who got it could die. So it's hugely, hugely deadly. Variolation had a roughly 1% fatality rate. So the idea is if you saw a pandemic or an epidemic of smallpox was starting in an area, you could protect yourself, your family, and your kids at some very significant risk by infecting yourself on purpose. So we don't generally use this anymore because we use vaccines. They're much safer. They actually had some mandatory variolation. I think it was in England in the late in the 1800s sometime, before they had vaccines. Vaccines started to come around only like 40 years later, I think. So it wasn't used for very long. But it was illegal in the United States, actually, before the revolution. And George Washington broke the law and used variolation on a bunch of his soldiers to protect them from smallpox, just in flagrant disregard for the law.
He was all about that, though, wasn't he?
Yes, that's right. He didn't really, obviously he didn't care.
Right.
But the basic idea here is, and why it's relevant today, is the creation of a vaccine is a very challenging thing. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to get one out and to verify it's safe, and then to manufacture it widely. Variolation has a much shorter amount of time to be introduced. You could start doing it effectively immediately.
Yeah.
And I would argue that given the extraordinarily low risk to death from COVID, as we covered last time, from people who are younger, you could establish whether or not variolation was effective in a very safe and ethical manner by asking for volunteers who would then voluntarily be infected and to see if this treatment worked. And then you could introduce it into others. So part of this would just be to basically increase the number of people who had been exposed to create a herd immunity faster.
Yeah.
Part of it would be as a proof of concept so that you could do it in older folks who are at a very high risk. So you would establish some safe methodology or dose with younger, healthier people that resulted in immunity. You establish that, and then you apply that to some volunteers who are older. In general, these kinds of like human challenge type trials are not done these days because they are considered in violation of medical ethics. But in my view, if you thought this was a very serious disease and it was on a volunteer basis, then I think informed consent would be enough to make it ethical.
Yeah. I mean, how is that any different than the people that are on the front lines? Like, they're exposing themselves and everybody claps for them or whatever. I know in England, it's like almost like a law that you have to go out at some time at night and everybody claps for the healthcare workers. So. Because
they recognize they're putting themselves on the line. But people's reactions to these things are not entirely driven by reason. I mean, there's a funny example of this. So in this case, it's, letting people voluntarily expose themselves would be unethical, but just letting them do it in a way that doesn't advance our knowledge is ethical.
Right.
So it's irrational. You know, it's the same thing. So if Facebook has two versions of its user interface and it shows some people one and some people the other and measures their responses to see which one increases engagement, people consider that somewhat unethical. But if they just change their user interface without doing any tests to some completely new thing, that is considered ethical. Right. So it's not like people's have like a gut reaction, and it's very strong. And the thing to realize here is that the reason we are doing this is because we're taking the threat seriously. And we may not be able to develop a vaccine from this, but this variolation is something that can be done immediately. It has a proven historical track record, and it can be done. And I think particularly since we know now that this doesn't pose a huge risk to young people, the early stages can be done very safely.
Yeah.
So I would encourage, if you're interested in that, there's a professor named Robin Hansen. He has some material on variolation. He's been a big proponent of this. You can look up more on that.
Yeah, you could kiss somebody with COVID.
You could
start that. Yeah, I think that there is just like, conscious or unconscious, we are, sort of just, there is like the active participants, and then the large part of the country that is being more and more and more trained to just be like the recipients of whatever this like group of actors figures out for them. And
yes.
So I think that variolation and having volunteers brings the like passive, people into this sort of actor stage. And that's just somehow it's just like incongruent with the normal mindset now. And but it's like, okay, so human trials, that's barbaric. Animal testing, that's barbaric. I mean, at some point, it's like, how do you make a change? You're just stuck.
Right.
Like, hey, this is the makeup that we have. We're never going to change because we can't test it on animals and we can't test it on people. And to change would then just be a worldwide human trial. Like, so we're stuck. We're just
right. So and that's what I said last time, is that, nothing is bad except in comparison to something else. So it's like, sure, okay, fine. You have a view that in general, these human trials are bad, but is it better than not doing them?
Yeah.
So that's the question. It's not whether it's good or bad in and of itself. It's compared with the alternatives. Does this make sense? And I think it does. I think that if things keep going as well as they do, and we start reopening and nothing happens, then there'll be no need for them. But if you were among the people who said this was highly deadly and it's not something that we can open for until there's a vaccine, well, that just seems crazy, considering that we don't have one and we have no idea how long it would take to do one. At least with variolation, there's like a definitive endpoint.
Right.
And for the people who would say it's not safe to reopen because we can't effectively protect the older, more vulnerable population while letting everybody go to work, well, variolation would be a path to doing that. You would be able to infect someone, make sure they had it, and then confirm they have immunity afterwards, and then they're no danger to anyone.
Yeah. Oh, so I think that we have maybe time to do one more, and I was actually sort of looking through all this stuff. I think it might be nice to touch on Sweden, and maybe that might, sure. I don't know if that'll be just because, we spoke about it previously, and now it's been a whole month. So, possibly. And I know you have an interesting figure here, a different topic, but hospital bed occupancy with the actual data versus the predictions. It's wild.
Yes.
So we're going to include, I think I'm going to upload some version of our notes here to Google Drive. It'll just be like a PDF that I'll include that you can sort of download and we'll include some other stuff there. But anyway, so Sweden, where's Sweden at today? Now a month after, our last.
So I would say that they're doing well. They have more daily cases than some of their neighbors. Certainly, they're doing still better than the countries that did quite poorly. They're still better than the United Kingdom. But but they do have more than some of their neighbors. They have more than Germany. They have more than Denmark or Finland, some of these other countries that surround them. And people have said, well, this is proof that their strategy doesn't work. To which I usually respond, it's like, well, that isn't the standard that's being applied here. So the prediction was that if they went the path that they went, they would have much, much worse outcomes than their neighbors who lock down. And that simply is not the case. Like, that has been proven false. They didn't close down their businesses as much. I've heard people say for some reason that they thought that their economy would suffer just as much, but I have some data showing that is not the case, that they've had that they're going to have a greatly reduced reduction in their yearly GDP, and their unemployment numbers are not nearly as bad. In fact, their unemployment numbers for April, I believe, were so good that people were saying they didn't believe them at first. So So it's not as if they're going to be unaffected, and it isn't as if no one has died. But I would say that so far, the strategy has definitely not been proven to be the wrong one.
And by the way, this week, I think our numbers were 2.5 million more added to the unemployment payroll in the U.S.
It's looking very, very bad. At this point, people have probably seen the little graphics of the unemployment rate, how it's spiked like it's never been seen before. So it is something that should be taken into account, because people do need to work in order for there to be something to come back to when you come out of lockdown, as I was saying earlier. Yeah. But the basic idea is that the Swedish strategy is looking pretty good so far. They definitely have more total deaths than a lot of their neighbors, but to some extent, that is what would be expected. I mean, the strategy, unless there's some secret sauce or some magic, you would expect them to have more cases and more deaths early on, but fewer or the same overall, and a reduced damage and disruption in their economy. Like, that is the hypothesis. So you can't say on the basis of them having a more per day right now than some of their neighbors that the strategy didn't work.
Right. Yeah. Isn't there the Spanish flu, a comparison between like Philadelphia and St. Louis that kind of sort of shows that play out over some number of months, where like the total number of deaths actually comes out to be pretty similar? There's just a massive spike in the beginning in Philadelphia because they had the parade and whatever.
I definitely saw those curves. I don't remember hearing what the integral under the curves was, whether it was the same or different. I will say this: I have a paper here.
Don't say integral under the curve.
Sorry, the area under the curve. So I do have a paper here that looks at the impact of the Spanish flu, the 1918 Spanish flu, on the economy. The comparisons here are very difficult because we were in the middle of a war then, and so the demand for certain sets of goods was quite high. But what the researchers conclude is that it is almost impossible to say, oh, I see the effects of the Spanish flu on the U.S. economy. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a large drop in GDP that year, whereas we're looking at something in the 20 to 30% range, possibly. Yeah. Well, for the quarterly, I don't remember what it's going to be for the full year. I don't think anybody does yet, because we still got a long way to go. But the reality is that, it grew 1% in 1919. So the U.S. economy. So the point is that whatever people want to say about particular sets of cities, the reality was that we did not have as big of an impact. And you could chalk that up to anything. You could say, well, we couldn't afford to in X, Y, or Z. Mm-hmm. But this idea that we did something similar to then and it has shown to work is just not based in any data.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't expect that even if we are hit with the same sort of proportional effects that is as bad or even worse than Great Depression era numbers. It's not like I wouldn't expect people to be starving, in the streets in large numbers in the United States, because we have built up so much wealth over the time in between these, events that we can produce food so cheaply and so quickly. We shouldn't be that, but nonetheless, we're just sort of setting back the clock of progress.
And not just for us, too. I mean, as we discussed on the last podcast, I mean, our economic output is a matter of life and death for people who are on the margins in the world, people who are living on a few dollars a day. And even more so than when we spoke last time, it is planned that there will be large numbers of deaths from those economic effects. Yeah. But going back to Sweden, I want to paint a fair picture. So I think I'm still pretty optimistic on this, and I haven't seen anything that seriously refutes the strategy. But they did release some serology data. Basically, this is a different kind of test where it says if you had it in the past and have antibodies, and the number of people that they got a positive for that was lower than expected. And this leads to a calculation for the infection fatality ratio, which is higher than I would have expected a few weeks ago. So there is some negative data there. Now, whether or not So this talks about how many people need to have it before the disease can effectively circulate. This is this herd immunity idea that we talked about last time. Based on the new Swedish data, they'd probably be up somewhere in the 12% range now. At first blush, this sounds like it's really far away from being the 50 or 60% that some people say is needed for herd immunity. But that's only under like the most simplistic models. The basic idea here is that if the disease spreads really easily, then you need relatively more people to be immune before it can't circulate anymore. But the number that you actually need depends very heavily on how connected people are. This is something that, again, we talked about last time. So if there are a small number of people who are doing a lot of the connections, you need a relatively lower number. And it could be as low as 20% before you start to see, even for a disease that spreads easily, before it starts to really not be able to sustain an epidemic anymore.
So possibly the super spreader type theory could benefit this then.
Exactly. That would, and there is additional evidence for that hypothesis now versus when we talked last time. I would also say that when we spoke last time, the daily deaths in Sweden were still like, maybe they were coming down, but it was pretty close. And they definitely have gone down since then. And so if it is the case that only a small fraction have been exposed, and that you need a very large fraction before you have effective herd immunity, then you're forced to ask, because their policies haven't changed, why are deaths going down? So this is just more evidence that the standard models aren't giving us a lot of predictive power for what's going on here. So it remains to be seen. Now, I have my own hypothesis that I've been developing based on some newer papers that have come out. It's definitely not mainstream or anything like that yet, but I think that there's some credibility to it, and I'd be happy to share that if you want me to.
Okay.
Basically, the idea here is that there was some papers that have come out that said you could get. So let me step back. So normally, if a new virus is introduced from an animal, no one has any base immunity to it, and it can just spread through the population easy as anything. But for most viruses, especially sort of very similar ones, similar coronaviruses, there is some base level immunity that from exposure to other similar viruses. And there's evidence to suggest that this kind of partial immunity does exist for the novel coronavirus that causes COVID. And my hypothesis is that there are similar coronaviruses giving partial immunity and that they've been circulating in Asia for a while. And this may be the primary reason why a lot of those countries have seen lower death rates than countries in the West, because Australia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, all these places have been exposed to the similar coronaviruses as the novel coronavirus. And so it remains to be seen. And I propose there's some tests that you could do to see this. And this is the kind of thing that we'll find out more about as time progresses. But what we can say for sure is that the data that we've seen doesn't match like the models that are being put forth in the beginning or even in the interim, because we should have already seen an uptick from the partial reopenings.
Yeah. Well, so hopefully, I mean, it does seem like the momentum is on. It sounds like the natives are getting restless at your house.
Yes.
So we can start to wrap things up if we want. But I mean, the good news is it seems like the momentum is that, states are starting to open up businesses. It's at least becoming like not illegal to operate your business in a lot of places in the United States. So that is nice. And I think that is just going to continue. I mean, sure, I would assume too, the fact that the summer is coming and, that will probably tamp it down even more. And then the concern to me is really when you start to get back around into flu season again, do we see an uptick in this? And what's going to happen at that point. But maybe we can save that for our predictions for the for the next flu season for a follow-up episode.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Is there any? Man, there's a lot of topics still, though. I did want to talk about the contact tracing. We'll just have to try to get back within.
We could do one more topic.
Okay. Would contact tracing be the one? I mean, because it actually kind of touches a libertarian, civil liberties type stuff.
Go ahead.
Oh, and it's something that I talked about on an episode before with you about with South Korea, and I know that was like somewhat of a question with how they handled it, and would they even be able to sell the American public? I would argue they can sell the American public on anything they damn well please. I mean, they just do whatever they want anyway. So I think, but I don't know that I think would be interesting, because that's something they're saying like, okay, well, we can open up, but we have to do this, so.
Contact tracing is basically the idea that we'll find out the people who have caught it. So basically the idea is you lock down for a while, you reduce the number of people who have the disease to a very low level. And then as you reopen, every time you see one case, you take it very, very seriously. Mm-hmm. And what you try to do is contact everyone who that person has been in contact with and put them all in isolation. There's a lot of ways you could look at the feasibility of this, from the number of people that it would be required to isolate to whether it can actually work given the dynamics of the coronavirus to begin with. So some of this will be obvious, but the idea is if the virus spreads via people being asymptomatic, it's going to be very hard to do contact tracing, because if someone gets the disease, doesn't cough or sneeze anyone, and just spreads it around through casual contact, and you never know they have it, how are you going to isolate them? Mm-hmm. So there is a paper in Science that said, contact tracing is feasible under the following assumptions. And those assumptions, I think, are very difficult to justify. Basically, they're saying it would require something like universal adoption of an app that you would put on your phone, mm-hmm. maybe even one that would be integrated into its operating system. So like basically mandatory app on your phone that would track all the people that you were in contact with around you via Bluetooth. And then if you got it, they'd have some way of contacting all of those people, letting them know you have been in contact with someone that has coronavirus.
Woof.
Yeah, I know. So if you think they're ever going to take that off of your phone once it's on there, that it won't be used for anything else, that seems very unlikely to me.
Oh boy.
I mean, it also relies. So that's one thing. So near universal adoption. So there's civil rights concerns there, civil liberties concerns there, and then it also relies on this asymptomatic fraction, which in this paper estimates it at 18%, which I think is way too low. I mean, we've seen studies from the port plant, from the aircraft carrier, were much, much higher asymptomatic fractions than that were observed. Now, it is important to distinguish between pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic, but the reality is that their own citation, which justifies this 18%, also includes that they think 30% is feasible, but they didn't say that in their paper.
Right. Yeah.
So this is just an example of what you were saying earlier, where, no one who read this paper for Science, which for those who don't know is probably the number 2 journal maybe in the whole world, or one of the top couple if you don't include some of the big med journals, has this number. The conclusion is critical to it, and either no one checked the citation or said maybe you should mention some of these other works, including your own citation that says some of these much higher numbers are feasible.
Right. Yeah.
So it would also imply that these contacts, when you're saying it, they would hand you a form that says, if you're lucky, you have to isolate in your house. And maybe if you're unlucky, they said there's this thing called centralized quarantine, which the U.S. did employ itself for some things at some time, where there is a government building where you are relocated to forcibly once you have been exposed to make sure you don't spread it to others. That's centralized quarantine.
Yeah. Unreal. I mean, it's such a crazy overreaction. And, I remember we were talking about contact tracing before, or, last episode where you were talking about maybe in the beginning, but now, I mean, there's literally millions, tens of millions of people that are at least, that, right. I mean, isn't that the numbers would suggest that there are tens of millions of people, at least with the antibodies now. Right. So, I mean, how many people have been infected? I mean, I guess if you just had some app that was just notifying people, just pinging around, and you had sort of servers doing it. I guess but yeah, I mean, you're going to wind up quarantining 30% of the country, again, well, I mean, forcibly.
I still think that it seems somewhat infeasible. I mean, let's look at, so we had daily confirmed cases in the U.S., and we've been on the downslope. Is that over 20,000 still? So if you're going to do contact tracing, so let's assume that we don't get this down by more than another factor of 2 before we open. Because like you said, things are already starting to reopen. So if we're going to do contact tracing, when we have 20,000 new cases a day, well, how many contacts does each person have? At least, 5? That's like a bare minimum, right? Mm-hmm. So what, are we going to put in quarantine 100,000 people a day?
Right.
It just doesn't seem like the kind of thing that is workable.
The last day was 22,000, but yeah, we've been hovering. We've had a day under 19. There seems to be something that you look in the daily deaths. It's a very interesting pattern, and I don't know if it's just because of the way it's reported. I mean, that would be my assumption. But I mean, you see a very smooth overall curve, but then you just see this sort of a very clear higher frequency sort of wave on top of it. But yeah, my assumption would be if it that there's some weekly number that keeps.
The centralized source that they usually pull these data from is on the day that it's reported, not necessarily when the day the death occurred. Mm-hmm. And so basically, because of the way that they do these reports in batches, that's what leads to these bumps, I believe, is the generally accepted explanation.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, I mean, it's literally every 7th bar is the spike of that hump. So yeah, I guess that's the weekly spread. Anyway, cool. So give up your liberties for an ineffective strategy.
It may be what to ask of you. So I'd be careful and prepare for that.
Yeah. So, all right. Okay. Well, let's wrap it up there. It's about hour and a half in. Solid episode. It's right in the sweet spot of mine. Sometimes I've gone, over under. I think 90 minutes is a nice, a nice length.
A nice movie.
Yeah. Is there right? Exactly. There's a lot of research, I think, to back that up. So yeah, I don't know. Do you want some closing remarks for Memorial Day weekend? COVID-19.
I think that we're looking pretty good. The trends look fine. I would say that as far as overall understanding, it's not been enhanced all that much in the last month. I mean, I think that it's becoming more clear that the threat was overstated and that we're probably going to be all right. But in terms of real understanding or even where we got it wrong, I don't think we have a good idea of that yet.
Okay. Yeah, my closing remarks, I feel much meaner.
Go ahead.
But no, I got a lot off my chest a couple episodes before. I think I did them back-to-back days. The 2 episodes where I really, really ranted. But in those, I wish that my friends that are so easily declare other, fellow citizens murderers and racists and whatever, I wish they had the wherewithal to go back and show some contrition, when you're blatantly wrong. But I know this is
it would be
thinking.
nice.
Yeah. Like course correct. Like,
right.
Because in the beginning, I was about, you can go back to my, episode at the beginning of this. I was kind of like, hey man, like, because we were in, I think like single digit 1,000 cases at that point. And I remember saying like, hey, what does this look like when we hit 10,000? Like some people think we're not locking down or blah, blah, blah. And, and at that point, I mean, I had nothing to go on. I just sort of was saying, hey, yeah, I guess like I'm okay with working from home because I can just do it. So like, what's the big deal? And I'm naturally, sort of bent in that direction of isolation. So it's like not that big of a deal. But, as time has gone on and, more, research is out and more numbers are available, I sort of changed my tune and yeah, like I don't really give the government benefit of the doubt, but in this case, like I'll even say like, hey, okay, like maybe that's what it seemed like in the beginning. I mean, the numbers coming out of China or the information coming out certainly pointed to the fact that this was a much more deadly disease towards older people, which that was true. So that was information available from the beginning that was basically just ignored. I mean, there's not one thing done on any level of government that particularly helps older people or high risk people. Nothing. Like I don't think I'm wrong. I mean, can you point to one thing? There's not been, there's not been anything to help them quarantine easier or, it's all been blanket for everybody. And that was flawed. And it was, the initial analysis was that was not the correct approach. And that has never changed.
Yes, I can't think of anything where the resources were specifically directed to that.
Yeah. And then, and so you know what? They murdered people. They killed people. Damn it.
There you go.
But I say that with some knowledge now, right? Like this is like they ignored it. Now, I mean, the murderer is saying they did it on purpose. I'm just saying, right? Like I do think that if
it's more of a manslaughter, really.
Right, okay. Yeah, we'll say that. Maybe third degree, second degree.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Reckless disregard.
Yeah, sure. So anyway, it irks me, and it's amazing how many people, intelligent, college educated, pretty well off, certainly have the means to get any access to to have access to any information they want, still think that they want to like boycott businesses that are opening, but it's quickly falling off, and then they'll completely forget that they were ever that 2 weeks prior that they were calling Kemp, right? That's my governor.
Yes,
I think. Kemp. They were calling him a murderer. What was the headline?
Experiment in human sacrifice or exercise in human sacrifice.
Yeah, buddy. Cool. So
hey, you know what? I'd be content with them just pretending like they were right all along, as long as they get smart.
Yeah. But then they're just gonna, it keeps them as the authority, and not that we're doing anything that will ever disrupt this. I don't know what, I really, I think, well, you may have even listened back when the podcast was titled No Hope, but I've been, wanting to kind of go back to that because I feel like it really captures the essence of where I'm at. Like, I don't know what else to do, but I feel like at least I'm trying, for me, like I could just say, F it, like I'm just gonna, whatever, just ignore this and try to be happy. But I just can't, and it's just in my DNA. And on my father's gravestone, he tried. That was what
Yes.
he put on his.
Yes.
He said, "Fuck it, man. Like at least I tried." And he was so he died a long time ago when I was 4 years old. But he was all torqued up. There's stuff he wrote about the communists and stuff.
Oh wow,
it's pretty neat. Yeah, because he died in 81. So
okay,
but anyway, topic for another time. So I guess with that we'll wrap up.
Okay, thank you, Pat.
I think people are going to want you to come back another one. I mean, we'll try to do it before another month, but maybe timing them once a month. Maybe I could pop in a solo episode if we can in the interim. But I think the weekends we can normally find a time, so we'll see. But thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Yep. Talk to everybody soon. Bye-bye.
Thoughts like water, get it to your sister, brother, mother, father, or daughter. Can't tell where you end and where they begin. Human centipede of bullshit echoes within. Dumb down, and you don't even know. Don't come around, and you won't even know. I'm tired of the words that's coming out your mouth. Better play it safe and keep my name out your mouth. Boring. Y'all ain't saying nothing. Dumber.